reflecting. Good Yontif. Wow. So we're returning. This is the time, right? We're getting ready to ascend to the gates of heaven, and we're all doing it together. Every one of us has our own journey of return, and we all have our own stories along that journey. And we're all in this together. So all of our stories of return are kind of intertwined and nestled into each other. And they're intertwined in a kind of tapestry that we sort of wear up to the gates of heaven together. And it includes our ancestors' stories as well. You know, Emmanuel was talking about the convocation above and below. And we have the stories of our ancestors and our stories combined. There's kind of a cross-pollination that goes on at this time of year. Actually, it goes on all of the time. Our healing heals our ancestors, and our ancestors help us heal, and we all ascend and descend together.
Amen.
So that was kind of a long way to introduce this very kind of basic story that I learned many years ago. It was the first story about the Baal Shem Tov that I ever learned. It was about 20 years ago. And hopefully it'll help us all return. So those of you who don't know, when I say the Baal Shem Tov, I'm talking about the great Rabbi Israel ben Eliezer, who was in the 18th century, who was really the founder of the Hasidic movement. He was the first Rebbe to say what's most important, more important than the order of the prayers or the words of the prayers, the most important thing is what comes from the heart. And he transformed Judaism. And Jewish renewal, this jewel, is really in the lineage of the Baal Shem Tov. So once, when the Baal Shem Tov knew that his days were numbered, and he was in his last weeks, he called his disciples, his Hasidim, to him to let them know what they should do, what their assignments were after he died. And to one he said, you will build a school, you will start a synagogue, you will teach, you will sing, etc., until he got to the last one. And that was Rebbe Yaakov. And Rebbe Yaakov was the Baal Shem Tov's personal assistant. And he said, you, Yaakov, you will travel the world and tell stories about me. And Yaakov said, a storyteller? And the Baal Shem Tov said, yes, a storyteller. And Yaakov said, but how will I make a living? And the Baal Shem Tov said, don't worry, people love to hear stories, and they will take you in, and they will feed you and take care of you. And Yaakov said, but must I travel around telling stories about you forever? And the Baal Shem Tov said, no, not forever. And Yaakov said, you know, I might want to settle down sometime and raise a family. How will I know when my work is done? And the Baal Shem Tov said, you'll know. There will be a sign. And soon after that, the Baal Shem Tov died. And Rebbe Yaakov went out into the world telling stories about his holy master. And you know what? He found out he loved it. Every time he told a story about the Baal Shem Tov, it brought the Baal Shem Tov to life for him and for everyone who was listening. And he could see in their faces the spark, and he loved telling stories. And of course, everyone fed him and clothed him and took care of him, just like promised. But after a while, after a few years, year after year, he was getting tired. And he knew that he wanted to settle down, and he was looking for that sign. And he heard that there was a very wealthy Jew in Italy who would pay large sums of money for any story about the Baal Shem Tov. And he thought, well, maybe this is the sign. Who knows more stories about the Baal Shem Tov than me? I was his personal assistant. I know all the stories, and he'll pay me so much money I could retire. And so he traveled to Italy. And eventually he was led to the home of this very wealthy Jew. And when he got there, the Jew came running out and greeted him. He was so happy to see him, and he said, I hear you have stories of the Baal Shem Tov. He said, oh yes, I have many, many stories of the Baal Shem Tov. I was his personal assistant. Shall we start now? And his host said, no, let's wait. It's almost Shabbat. Come in, relax, and after Shabbat dinner, that'll be the time. And so Yaakov was brought in. He was given a luxurious suite and a bath and fine clothing. And after Shabbat prayers and dinner, they sat down. Everyone gathered around for a story. And Yaakov stood up and he said, once the Baal Shem Tov excuse me. Once the Baal Shem Tov, his mind was a complete blank. I can tell you this is a storyteller's nightmare. Everyone was staring at him, and he was totally blank. So he tried what storytellers do. He closed his eyes, he reached deep within, he tried to conjure the images, he tried to visualize the images of a Baal Shem Tov story, and nothing came. And he said, I am so sorry. I'm really, really sorry. I must be tired, but I can't think of anything. And his host said, don't worry, you're tired. You've traveled a long distance. We'll try again tomorrow. And tomorrow, after davening, the next day on Shabbat, they davened, and then they gathered around after the next meal. And again, Yaakov stood up, and again the same thing happened. Nothing in his mind. Erased. Blank. And after the next meal of Shabbat, the same thing. And after the last meal of Shabbat, he had nothing. And he felt so, so ashamed. And when he left, he said to his host, I am so, so sorry. I can't tell you how sorry I am. I really don't know what to say. And his host said, it's all right. And he gave him a large sum of money. And he said, thank you for coming. Thank you for your troubles. And if you think of another story, if you think of a story anytime, come back. And Yaakov went off. And he was riding in the carriage. And he hadn't gotten very far. And all of a sudden a story came into his mind. He ordered the horses, the carriage turned around, and they raced back to the Jew's house, and he ran out of the carriage, and his host was running out of the house, and Yaakov said, I remembered something. It's not much. It's just a little snippet of something. I don't even know what it means. I don't know how it starts. I don't know how it ends, but his host said, tell me now. Yaakov said, all right. So once, the Baal Shem Tov was very, very agitated during Shabbat. And then as soon as Shabbat was over, he ordered all of us Hasidim into the carriage. And we rode through the night with Alexei, the driver, letting go of the reins. And finally, in the morning, we stopped. And we were in a little town. And all of the houses were boarded up. And I knew that this was the Jewish quarter. But everything was dark. It was like a ghost town. And the Baal Shem Tov walked up to a house, a little ramshackle hut. And he knocked on the door. And a woman opened the curtains. And she called down, don't come in the house. No one can come in. Today is the day of a pogrom. Any Jew on the streets will be killed. Go away. And the Baal Shem Tov called up and said, I am Israel ben Eliezer, the Baal Shem Tov. Let me in. All will be well. And the woman came down and she opened the door, and all of us crowded into this little house. And then the Baal Shem Tov went over to the window where the curtains were drawn tight, and he opened the curtains, and everyone else in the house said, no, 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 don't open the curtains, we can't be seen. But the Baal Shem Tov pointed across the street, and there was a large square, and there were people gathering, a crowd. And it was clear there was going to be some kind of a riot, and everyone was all worked up. And there was a podium. And walking up to the podium was a bishop in full regalia. And he walked up onto the podium, and he was about to speak, to incite the crowd. And the Baal Shem Tov turned to me and he said, Yaakov, see that bishop? Go, tell him I want to speak to him now. I was terrified. Everyone screamed, no, no, don't let him go. But the Baal Shem Tov said, Yaakov, go. I had to obey my master. And so I walked across the street, and it was almost as if the Red Sea parted. And I walked straight through the crowd and up onto the podium. And the bishop turned and stared at me, and I said, my master, the Baal Shem Tov, wants to see you now. And he looked down at me, and then he looked back at the crowd. And he turned back and he said, tell him I will be there in 10 minutes. And so I went back and I told the Baal Shem Tov, and he said, go back, tell him now. And I went again, and again the Red Sea parted, and I walked up onto the podium, and I said to the bishop, my master, the Baal Shem Tov, says, now. And he turned, and he followed me back across, and we went into the house. And then the bishop and the Baal Shem Tov, well, they were in that room alone for about an hour. I don't know what went on, but when they came out, the bishop's face had changed. There were tears streaming down his face. His whole being had softened. And then he went out the back door, and we went back home. And I'm really sorry, but I don't know what else happened. I cannot tell you the rest of the story. And Yaakov looked up, and he saw his host. There were tears streaming down his face. And he said, Yaakov, I can tell you the rest of the story. And Yaakov said, I don't understand. Don't you recognize me, Yaakov? No. I was that bishop. But you're a Jew. I was born a Jew. I was raised a Jew, but I had a terrible childhood. And when I grew up, I converted to the religion of the land, of the other people around me. But I found that the more that I criticized the Jews, the higher I rose in the church, until I became the bishop. And every year on that day, the day that you saw, I would incite people to kill the Jews. And I knew in my heart it was wrong. But I loved the power, and I couldn't stop. And then one night I had a dream. And in the dream, I could see all of my ancestors gathered around a table. And there was something very small on the table. It was like a shriveled little seed. And I realized that was my soul. And my ancestors said, is there any hope for this soul? And just then in the dream I saw the Baal Shem Tov. He walked in, he picked up that seed, and he said, There is always hope for any soul. And he touched that seed and it began to grow. And when I woke up, I knew that the Baal Shem Tov himself was going to intercede on my behalf, but I didn't know when. And when you walked up to that platform, I knew my time had come, but I looked back at the crowd and I didn't want to go. And then I knew I had to. And with the Baal Shem Tov in that hour, the Baal Shem Tov opened my heart and restored my soul. I wept my heart out and I said to him, how can I make tshuva? How can I be forgiven for what I have done? And he said, go with all of your money, build a school, build a synagogue, invite Jews, everyone to your house every week for Shabbat. Feed them, teach them, and pray for forgiveness every single day. I said to him, I will do that, but how will I know when I have been forgiven? And the Baal Shem Tov said, you'll know when someone comes and tells you your story. So Yaakov, I did everything that he said. I prayed and I built the school, I invited everyone, and I let it be known that I would pay great sums of money for any story of the Baal Shem Tov, hoping to hear my story. And when you showed up, I was overjoyed. I saw that you didn't recognize me, but I knew that you knew the story. And then when you stood up and nothing came, my heart sank. And each time that you tried and nothing came, my heart sank lower. And when you left, I fell on my knees in complete despair. I had lost all hope and my heart was completely broken. I wept from the bottom of my soul with no hope left, only my broken heart. And then I heard the carriage returning, and you came back and told me my story. And now I know that I've been forgiven. And Rebbe Yaakov knew that his work was done. And so may we all this year pray from the bottom of our hearts and maybe recognize a little bit of our story in each other's story. Good Yom Tov.